Georgia Williams was the kind of person you'd be lucky to know. The kind of young woman who walked into a room and within minutes made everyone feel like they belonged. She had this rare energy about her, the kind that made you think, wow, the world needs more people like her. But as we all know, sometimes the world doesn't get to keep the people it needs the most. She grew up in Telford, England, raised by parents who not only loved her but admired her. And that's not something every parent can say. It wasn't just that Georgia was their daughter, it was that she was Georgia, a girl full of life, ambition, and a sense of duty that most teenagers don't even think about. From an early age, she wasn't just thinking about what she wanted to be. When she grew up, she was thinking about what she could do to make a difference. She had dreams that went beyond herself. While other kids were daydreaming about being rich or famous, Georgia had her heart set on something that would truly matter, serving her country. Now, we're not talking about some fleeting childhood fantasy. This wasn't one of those I want to be a firefighter today and a rock star tomorrow kind of things. No, Georgia's dream of joining the Royal Air Force was real. It was something she thought about constantly. She was the kind of person who actually followed through on what she said. The kind who put in the work. The kind who didn't make excuses. By the time she was a teenager, she was already involved in things that were building her character, preparing her for the path she had chosen. She joined the Air Training Corps, an organization meant for young people who wanted to develop the skills, discipline, and mindset needed for a military career. And let me tell you, she wasn't just showing up to these training sessions, she was excelling. She was stepping up as a leader, proving to herself and to everyone else that she was ready for this. And that's the thing about Georgia, she was a natural-born leader. Not because she was loud or demanding, but because people wanted to follow her. She had this quiet confidence, this unshakable belief in herself and in others. It wasn't about power for her, it was about responsibility. Her father, Steve Williams, was a police detective, so maybe that's where she got her sense of justice, her need to stand up for what's right. But it wasn't just about following in his footsteps, it was about carving out her own legacy. She had this deep, ingrained sense of duty, and that's not something you can fake. That's something that comes from who you are at your core. Georgia's kindness wasn't just surface level. She didn't do things for people because she wanted something in return. She did them because that's just who she was. If you needed help, Georgia was there. If you were struggling, Georgia would listen. If you felt like the world was against you, Georgia would make you believe in yourself again. She was fiercely loyal. To her friends, to her family, to her dreams. The kind of person you could call in the middle of the night, and she'd actually pick up. She was always lifting people up, always encouraging others. And in a world that can be so damn cruel, she was the kind of person who made you believe in the good again. Her friends describe her as someone who was always smiling, always laughing. She had this ability to turn even the worst days around. She was funny, but not in a way that tried too hard. She just had that effortless kind of humor that made you feel lighter, like everything was going to be okay. And despite being so driven, she wasn't someone who took life too seriously. She knew how to have fun, how to enjoy the moment, but she also knew what she wanted. She wasn't lost like so many people her age. She had purpose. Now, imagine that. Imagine being a young woman who has everything ahead of her, who is standing right at the edge of her future, ready to take on the world. Imagine being so full of hope, so full of potential, so full of life. And now imagine that someone takes all of that away. Because that's exactly what happened to Georgia. She was only 17 years old. 17. That's nothing. That's the age where your life is supposed to be just beginning. But instead of getting to step into the future she worked so hard for, Georgia had hers ripped away by someone she thought was a friend, someone she had known for years, someone who had secretly been obsessed with her in the most twisted way possible. Georgia wasn't just another victim of violence. She was a victim of trust. She was a victim of someone else's sickness, someone else's evil. And that's what makes this story so damn devastating. Because Georgia should be here today. She should have lived the life she dreamed of. She should have gone on to serve her country, to inspire more people, to leave behind a legacy that she chose, not one that was forced upon her by a monster. And yet, despite the horror of what happened to her, Georgia's name still means something. She's remembered not because of how she died, but because of who she was, because of how she lived, because even in the face of such a senseless tragedy, her light hasn't gone out. It's still here in the people who loved her, in the people who refused to let her be forgotten. Georgia Williams was more than just a girl with a dream. She was someone who deserved the world. And if nothing else, let's make sure her story isn't just another statistic. Let's make sure people remember her name. Jamie Reynolds wasn't just troubled. He wasn't just a loner. He wasn't just another guy who didn't quite fit in. No, he was something much darker than that. The kind of darkness that doesn't always show itself right away. The kind that lurks beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal what it truly is. Because Jamie Reynolds didn't just have an obsession, he was his obsession. For years, behind closed doors, away from the watchful eyes of the people who thought they knew him, he was building something. A sick, twisted world inside his own head. A world where he had complete and total control. A world where women weren't people, they were objects. Things to be dominated, things to be overpowered, things to be used for his own satisfaction. And the worst part, nobody saw it coming. Reynolds was quiet, introverted, the kind of guy who slipped under the radar. He wasn't the loud, aggressive type. He wasn't getting into fights or making scenes. He was the one you didn't notice until it was too late. And that's what made him so dangerous. Because while everyone else was living their normal lives, Jamie Reynolds was spiraling further and further into a fantasy that should have set off every alarm. His obsession with controlling women didn't just appear overnight. This was something that had been growing for years. It started small, as these things often do. Little red flags that, on their own, might not have seemed like much. The way he talked about women, the way he fixated on certain people, the way his interests, his hobbies, all seemed to revolve around one thing: domination. But it didn't stop there. Reynolds had a fascination with violent, degrading imagery of women. His mind was consumed by thoughts of control, of power, of forcing others to submit. He spent hours, days, years feeding this obsession, watching it grow inside him like a disease. He wasn't just watching horror movies or violent thrillers like the average person. No, he was creating his own fantasy world. He was writing stories, drawing pictures, putting together twisted little scenarios where he was the one in control, where he got to decide who lived, who suffered, who disappeared. And if anyone had taken a closer look, if anyone had really paid attention to what he was creating, they would have seen something horrifying. Because Jamie Reynolds wasn't just fantasizing, he was planning. There were warning signs, big ones. In 2008, long before Georgia Williams ever stepped into his trap, Jamie Reynolds had already shown the world exactly what he was capable of. He had become obsessed with another girl. A different girl, but the same story. Someone he couldn't have. Someone he wanted to control. And when he couldn't have her the way he wanted, he decided to make her his. He lured her into his home under false pretenses, just like he would do with Georgia 5 years later. He locked the doors. He set up his camera. He had a rope ready. And then, at the last second, somehow she got away. She escaped. She lived. And Jamie Reynolds, he got a slap on the wrist. Instead of being locked away, instead of being recognized for the serious threat that he was, Jamie Reynolds was sent to counseling. Counseling. As if talking about his urges was going to fix what was already deeply broken inside of him. The system failed, and it gave him time. Time to let the obsession grow stronger. Time to perfect his fantasies. Time to find another girl. And that's exactly what he did. Georgia Williams was that girl. And the worst part, she trusted him. She had known him for years. Their families knew each other. There was no reason for her to think that Jamie Reynolds was anything more than a friend. And that's what made him so dangerous. He didn't look like a predator. He didn't act like a monster. He wasn't lurking in the shadows or prowling the streets at night. He was hiding in plain sight. And when the moment was right, when everything was perfectly in place, he did what he had been fantasizing about for years. He lured Georgia into his home under the pretense of a harmless photo shoot. She had no reason to be afraid, no reason to doubt him. He had been in her life for years. Why would she ever think he was capable of something like this? But the second she stepped into that house, she was never leaving. Jamie Reynolds had spent years imagining this moment, planning every detail. And once she was there, once the doors were locked, once there was no one to hear her scream, he lived out his darkest fantasy. He filmed it. He took photos. He documented every second, like some kind of sick trophy collection. Because for him, this wasn't just about hurting someone, it was about owning them, even in death. And then, just like that, he discarded her like she was nothing. Dumped her body miles away, as if she were just another piece of trash. But Jamie Reynolds wasn't some criminal mastermind. He wasn't clever. He wasn't careful. And the second the police caught up with him, the truth unraveled fast. Because Reynolds hadn't just made one mistake, he had made dozens. The evidence was everywhere, his fantasies, his plans, his obsession, it was all right there, laid out in disturbing detail. And when he realized there was no way out, when he knew the world would finally see him for what he was, he confessed. Not because he felt guilt, not because he had a shred of remorse, but because deep down Jamie Reynolds had never really wanted to hide. He wanted control. And in his mind, even in a prison cell, even facing a lifetime behind bars, he still had it. Because Jamie Reynolds got exactly what he wanted. The question is, how many more women would there have been if he had never been caught? Jamie Reynolds didn't just wake up one day and decide to take a life. That's not how these kinds of stories work. Monsters like him don't appear out of nowhere. They build themselves over time. They test the limits. They push boundaries. They see what they can get away with. And the most terrifying part, if they don't get stopped, if someone doesn't put a wall between them and their next victim, they just keep going. And that's exactly what happened with Jamie Reynolds. Years before he killed Georgia Williams, before he carried out the plan he had been obsessing over for so long, he had already tried something similar. And when I say tried, I don't mean some vague, creepy behavior. I mean he had already set the stage for a violent attack. He had already picked a target. He had already planned out what he wanted to do. And he had already acted on it. But when the authorities found out, when they had the chance to stop him, when they had him right there in front of them, they let him walk away. It was 2008, 5 years before Georgia's murder, and Jamie Reynolds had become obsessed with a different girl. A girl who, like Georgia, trusted him. A girl who thought she was safe around him. A girl who had no idea that, behind his quiet and awkward exterior, he was hiding something dangerous. Now, Jamie Reynolds wasn't the kind of guy who could just go up to a girl and make a real connection. He didn't have the confidence, the charm, or the basic social skills to form the kind of relationships he wanted. And when a guy like that has a mind filled with violence and control, he starts looking for other ways to get what he wants. So, just like with Georgia, he set up a trap. He convinced this girl to come over to his house under some innocent excuse, something that wouldn't make her suspicious. Maybe it was just a hangout. Maybe he told her he wanted to take pictures of her, just like he would later tell Georgia. Whatever the excuse was, it worked. She came over, she walked through that door, and she had no idea that Jamie had planned every second of what was about to happen. And when she stepped inside, he locked the door. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some awkward moment that got out of hand. Jamie Reynolds had prepared for this. He had a camera set up. He had a rope ready. He had everything he needed to turn his fantasy into reality. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was premeditated. Now we don't know exactly what went through that girl's mind when she realized something was wrong. But what we do know is that she fought like hell to get away. Somehow, maybe because Jamie was still figuring out how to carry out his twisted plans, maybe because he underestimated her, she escaped. She got out. She lived. And she told someone. The police got involved. They knew what he had tried to do. They had the evidence. And for a brief moment, there was a real chance to stop him before he went any further. But what happened next? Nothing. No charges. No real consequences. Jamie Reynolds didn't go to prison. He didn't even get a criminal record. Instead, the authorities decided that he just needed some help. Some counseling. Because apparently, this wasn't a serious enough crime to do anything more than give him a warning and send him on his way. Let me say that again. He lured a girl into his house, locked the doors, set up his camera, had a rope ready, and walked away from it without a single consequence. And that moment, that decision to let him go, that's what sealed Georgia Williams' fate 5 years later. Because, in Jamie Reynolds' mind, that wasn't a failure. It was a test run, and the message he got from the world was clear. You can do this and get away with it. So he kept going. He went right back to his fantasies, right back to his obsession. And this time, he got bolder. He started writing disturbing stories. Stories about men overpowering and killing women. Stories where he was in control. He drew violent images. He collected material that would make any sane person's skin crawl. And all the while he was waiting for his next opportunity, waiting for his perfect victim. And when Georgia Williams walked through his door 5 years later, he didn't let her escape. This time he finished what he started. And when the truth came out, when everyone finally saw who Jamie Reynolds really was, what he had been planning for years, you know what the police said. They admitted they should have stopped him in 2008. They admitted that the warning they gave him wasn't enough. They admitted that if they had taken him seriously back then, Georgia Williams would still be alive today. But none of that matters now, because Jamie Reynolds wasn't stopped when it counted. And because of that, Georgia never got to live the life she had planned. Because of that, a girl who had everything ahead of her was taken by a monster who should have never been free in the first place. Jamie Reynolds knew exactly what he was doing when he reached out to Georgia Williams that day. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. It wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't something that just happened. No, this was planned. This was something he had been thinking about, fantasizing about for years. And when the moment came, when everything was perfectly in place, he put his twisted plan into motion. Now Georgia and Jamie had known each other for a long time. Their families were friendly, they ran in the same circles, and Georgia had no reason to be afraid of him. That's what made this whole thing so terrifying. She trusted him. She had no idea that behind his quiet demeanor, Jamie Reynolds was hiding something dark. See, Jamie had been obsessed with Georgia for a while. And not in the way you'd expect from some awkward guy who has a crush on a girl. This wasn't admiration, it wasn't affection, it wasn't love. It was control. Jamie wasn't interested in Georgia as a person, he was interested in owning her, in making her part of his sick fantasy. And so he set the trap. He reached out to Georgia with what seemed like an innocent request. A photo shoot. That's all. Just some pictures. Maybe he told her it would be fun. Maybe he told her it would help with his photography portfolio. Whatever the excuse was, it was enough to put her at ease. Because why would she say no? Georgia was confident, adventurous. She wasn't the type to be easily scared or paranoid. And besides, she knew him. He wasn't some stranger off the street. He wasn't some mysterious figure in the shadows. He was Jamie, And that's exactly what he was counting on. When she agreed to come over, Jamie knew he had won. He had played his part perfectly. He had lured her in without a single ounce of suspicion. No struggle, no hesitation, no resistance, just trust. And trust is the deadliest weapon of all. On May 26, 2013, Georgia Williams walked into Jamie Reynolds' home for what she thought was a harmless photo shoot. Maybe she was excited. Maybe she was just doing a favor for a friend. Maybe she had a slight feeling that something was off but ignored it, because in her mind, Jamie wasn't a threat. But the moment she stepped through that door, she was never leaving, because Jamie Reynolds had been preparing for this. This wasn't a messy, impulsive act of violence. No, this was calculated. He had thought through every detail. The setting, the camera, the method. It was all there, waiting for her. And she had no idea. Maybe they made small talk at first. Maybe he directed her where to stand, adjusted the lighting, acted like a professional. Maybe, for a brief moment, Georgia actually felt at ease. But then in an instant, everything changed. Jamie snapped. He had no interest in taking pictures. There was never going to be a photo shoot. The second she walked through that door, she was part of his sick, twisted fantasy. And the most horrifying part, he filmed everything. Because Jamie Reynolds wasn't just about control, he was about reliving it, about keeping it, about turning it into something permanent. He wanted to have evidence of what he had done. He wanted to watch it back, to relive the moment he finally got to act on the obsession that had consumed his mind for years. But Jamie was no mastermind. He wasn't some criminal genius. He was sloppy. He was arrogant. And most importantly, he had no plan for what came next. After he had done the unthinkable, after Georgia was gone, reality started creeping in. He had gotten what he wanted, but what now? What did he actually think was going to happen? Because Jamie Reynolds wasn't just sick, he was also stupid. He dumped Georgia's body in remote woodland miles away, as if she were nothing, as if she hadn't been a living, breathing person just hours before. He thought he had covered his tracks, thought he had done enough. But the truth, he had left a trail of evidence so obvious that it was only a matter of time before police caught up to him. Georgia had told her parents she was going to Jamie's house for a photo shoot. People knew where she was going. She wasn't some runaway. She wasn't someone who had just disappeared into the night. She had been invited somewhere. And when she didn't come home, the police didn't have to look far. Because Jamie Reynolds, the same guy who had been given a chance to change after his first violent attempt 5 years earlier, had finally done exactly what everyone should have seen coming. And this time, there was no escape. Jamie Reynolds was arrested, and when police searched his home, they found everything. The setup, the disturbing material he had collected over the years, the carefully planned fantasies he had written out. It was all there. And when the truth came out, when people realized what he had done to Georgia, there was only one question left to ask. Why wasn't he stopped sooner? Because Georgia Williams should have never walked through that door. She should have never had to face a monster who had already proven he was dangerous. She should have still been alive. When Georgia Williams stepped into Jamie Reynolds' home that fateful day, she had no reason to fear. She was trusting, she was confident, and she had no clue what was waiting for her on the other side of that door. What should have been a simple photo shoot, an innocent request from someone she thought she knew, turned into a nightmare she could never escape. Jamie had set the stage. The door was locked. The room was dimly lit. The camera was ready, but this was not about photography. For Jamie Reynolds, this was about something much darker. He had lured Georgia into his trap, and now, with everything set in motion, there was no turning back. As Georgia entered the room, Jamie must have put on an air of calmness, maybe even made small talk, anything to ease her mind. Maybe he adjusted the lighting or asked her to move into position for the shoot. But none of that mattered. All of it was just a way to keep her calm, to keep her unsuspecting, because what Jamie Reynolds had planned was far more sinister than a simple photo session. At some point, though, the mask of normalcy dropped. Jamie's intentions were clear now. He wasn't interested in taking pictures. He wasn't interested in having a casual conversation. No, he was in control. And this was about him exerting that control over someone who trusted him, someone who had no idea what he was capable of. Without warning, Jamie attacked. There was no hesitation, no mercy. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a blur of confusion or panic. It was cold, it was methodical, and it was exactly what he had been preparing for in the darkness of his mind for so long. He didn't just pounce on her in a fit of rage. He planned this attack. It was calculated. Georgia must have realized in that instant that something was horribly wrong. Maybe she sensed a change in Jamie's demeanor. Maybe the air grew thick with tension. Whatever it was too late for her to get out. The door was locked. She couldn't run. She couldn't escape. Jamie Reynolds, the man she thought she knew, was now a predator. He moved quickly. With terrifying precision, Jamie grabbed a ligature. A simple piece of rope, maybe a belt, something that could be used to tighten around her neck. It wasn't some complex weapon, but in Jamie's hands, it was enough. Enough to take away Georgia's life, to take away her future. Enough to rob her of everything. The ligature was probably tight. She must have fought. Of course she fought. Who wouldn't? But the desperation in her movements, the fight for air, it was all so much more than she could handle. The pressure around her neck, the slow suffocating of life, it must have felt like an eternity. But it wasn't just physical. It was psychological too. For Georgia, the most terrifying must have been realizing that the person who was doing this, the person who was taking her breath away, was someone she had trusted. Someone who had been in her life, who had been so close, who had been pretending to be something he wasn't. Jamie wasn't just physically overpowering her, he was destroying her sense of safety. He was breaking her spirit in the worst way possible. And through all of this, there was no escape. She couldn't scream. She couldn't fight hard enough to break free. Jamie Reynolds had made sure of it. The ligature had already cut off her oxygen, and her body began to fail her. It was a slow and deliberate suffocation, not just of breath, but of Georgia's hope. She would have fought until there was nothing left of her strength, but the air slowly leaving her lungs would have told her everything she needed to know. The horrible truth, she wasn't going to make it out. Imagine the panic, the terror, her body's fight for life against the overwhelming force that was suffocating her. Every second would have felt like an eternity. Every second, her world shrinking, the darkness closing in around her, suffocating every ounce of life she had left. The fear must have been unbearable, the fight to breathe, the panic, and the realization that her trust had led her here, to this moment, where it would all be taken from her in the blink of an eye. And through it all, Jamie was there, cold, detached. He wasn't afraid of her, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. In his mind, Georgia was nothing more than a victim, a tool to fuel his sick fantasies. She was someone he could take control and destroy without remorse. Eventually, Georgia's body would have gone limp. The fight would have drained from her. But Jamie wasn't done. After he had taken the life of an innocent girl, he still needed to dispose of her like some piece of garbage, to cover his tracks, to erase the evidence of his crime. When she finally went quiet, when she finally stopped struggling, Jamie Reynolds had no more use for her. She was just another victim in his twisted path. And in that moment, when her life was stolen from her in such a brutal and senseless way, Georgia Williams was no longer just a girl with a bright future ahead of her. She was another name in a list of people who had been taken by someone who should never have been allowed to walk free. Her family, her friends, her loved ones, they would never get to see her again. And all because one man, one sick, twisted man had been allowed to continue living his life without consequence, allowed to strike again when he should have been stopped long ago. George's life was taken far too soon. And for what? For Jamie Reynolds to live out his delusional fantasies. No, it was not just a photo shoot. It was not just a moment of madness. It was a calculated act of violence that tore apart the fabric of what should have been her bright future. And it was horrifying to think that this is how it all ended for her. After Georgia Williams' life was brutally stolen from her, Jamie Reynolds' twisted obsession didn't end with her death. No, for him the horror was only just beginning. Once Georgia had been silenced, once her body lay lifeless on the floor, Jamie Reynolds did something that added yet another layer to his chilling crime. He didn't just dispose of her. He didn't just hide the evidence and walk away. He took it further. He posed her body. He set her up, like a doll, in a position that reflected the disturbing fantasy that had consumed his every waking thought. And then, as if it was some grotesque artistic expression, he took photographs. The photographs. Those images are what linger, what send a chill down your spine just thinking about them. Because what kind of mind thinks of posing a body after it's been murdered? What kind of mind derives pleasure from something like that? For Jamie Reynolds, it wasn't enough to take Georgia's life. It wasn't enough to strip her of her future, her ambitions, her dreams. No, Jamie needed something more, something to keep, something to remember this moment by. Because in his twisted mind he had won. He had taken control. He had exercised power over another human being in the most horrifying way imaginable. And now he wanted to preserve it. He wanted to relive it. He needed evidence of his sick victory, something to look back on when the real world felt too far from his fantasy. So he did what anyone driven by a dark obsession would do. He photographed it. Picture the scene. Imagine the grotesque setting he created. Georgia's lifeless body was no longer just a victim of his violence, it was a prop in his sick game, something he could manipulate, something he could control even in death. The crime scene was no longer just a murder scene. It had become a twisted stage for Jamie to act out his fantasies. The photos he took weren't just for him to relive the moment. They were evidence of the extent to which he had fallen into depravity. You see, when you take a life, when you reduce a person to nothing more than an object, something inside you breaks. You stop seeing them as a person. You stop seeing the humanity in them. But for Jamie Reynolds, Georgia was never a person. She was an object. She was a thing to be used, to be controlled, to be manipulated. So after taking her life, he went one step further. He decided to take away any dignity she had left. He stripped her of everything. Her body became an extension of his warped mind, a body that could be arranged, posed, and photographed for his own sick satisfaction. Now imagine the weight of those moments. Imagine how the camera clicked. Imagine the cold, clinical way Jamie must have looked at her, positioning her the way he wanted, making sure the photos turned out exactly how he had pictured them in his twisted mind. He wasn't taking photos of a person. He wasn't capturing a memory, a moment of beauty or truth. He was documenting his power, his control. These photos were proof of his domination over Georgia. They were nothing but a means to feed his sick ego and solidify his feeling of victory over someone he saw as nothing more than a vessel for his violent fantasies. And those photographs, they weren't just for him in that moment. Jamie Reynolds was a man with a terrifying sense of entitlement. He wanted to keep this evidence. He wanted to be able to look back on it. He needed to remind himself of his success, his ability to control, to take, and to destroy. It wasn't enough to just kill her. He wanted something to hold on to, something to prove that he had done it, that he had gotten away with it. So he took those photos, preserving them as trophies of his sick accomplishment. But Jamie Reynolds wasn't just a murderer. He was a selfish one. He didn't just see Georgia as an object. He saw her as a means to an end. The photos weren't about honoring her memory. They weren't about anything other than keeping the horrific experience alive. In his disturbed mind, these photos served a purpose beyond documenting the crime. They were a way to continue living out his fantasy, to feed the darkness inside him, to ensure that the thrill of control didn't just fade after the murder. It was as if for him capturing those photos the ultimate way to lock her away, not in a grave, not in a memory, but in an image he could look back on, something he could hold on to when the rush of taking her life began to dull. And most disturbingly, this wasn't a moment of panic for Jamie. It wasn't an impulsive action driven by fear or desperation. This was cold and calculated. This was a man who had planned every moment of this crime, down to the smallest detail. He wasn't some frightened, disoriented killer who was trying to cover his tracks. He was a man who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't feel the weight of remorse. He was a man who felt nothing for the life he had stolen. And in his mind, those photographs were his to keep. They were his reward, his proof of his control. It's hard to imagine what Georgia Williams' final moments were like. What was she feeling when she realized that her body was being treated like an object, not a human life? What was she thinking as her murderer arranged her lifeless body for his own sick pleasure, taking photographs as if it was some sick art project? The horror of those moments is almost unfathomable. When you think about the cruelty of this act, you can't help but wonder what could have been. What would Georgia Williams have gone on to achieve? What kind of life would she have led? What could she have done with her dreams, her ambitions, her compassion for the world? And yet all of it was taken from her. Not just her life, but her dignity, her humanity. All of it erased, reduced to nothing more than a trophy in Jamie Reynolds' hands. In the end, those photos, those disturbing, degrading images became a chilling reminder of just how far Jamie had fallen, just how far he was willing to go to feed his insatiable hunger for control. And ultimately they would serve as proof of a crime that could never be undone. After everything Jamie Reynolds had done, after he had taken Georgia Williams' life, posed her body, and snapped those grotesque photographs, most would expect him to go into hiding, to run from the authorities, to try and cover his tracks. After all, what kind of person would commit such an unthinkable crime and then simply walk away without fear of consequence? But in a shocking twist, that's not what Jamie did. Instead of hiding, instead of trying to erase the evidence, Jamie Reynolds did something far more baffling, something that left the authorities and everyone involved utterly stunned. He confessed. That's right, after everything, after the brutality, after the deliberate and chilling nature of his crime, Jamie Reynolds walked into a police station and confessed. No hesitation, no attempt to dodge responsibility. He simply walked in and admitted what he had done. He didn't try to lie. He didn't try to spin a story. He didn't even show the slightest sign of remorse or fear. He just confessed. Now imagine what that must have felt like. Imagine being one of the officers receiving this confession, trying to make sense of it. It was as if the weight of his crime, the cold-blooded murder of a young woman who had done nothing wrong, had been lifted off his shoulders in an instant. As if the burden of guilt that most criminals carry was simply not present in him. Jamie didn't act like a man overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions. No, he acted as though he were doing something entirely normal, something almost casual. This wasn't the confession of a man who was desperate, who was racked with guilt, who had been caught up in a crime that spiraled out of control. No, this was something entirely different. Jamie Reynolds' confession was disconnected and clinical, a chilling example of how removed he was from the reality of the horror he had caused. The act of confessing was almost mechanical for him, an act done, because it was part of his twisted narrative, not because he had any true sense of guilt. He wasn't confessing because he felt sorry. He wasn't confessing because he realized the magnitude of his actions. He wasn't confessing because he wanted to make amends. No, for Jamie, it was as though the confession itself was a necessary part of the crime. Think about it. Most people who commit murder do everything they can to avoid getting caught. They run. They lie. They destroy evidence. They try to cover their tracks, but not Jamie. Instead of doing what most would do, hide, evade, pretend he hadn't done it, Jamie Reynolds just walked up to the police and openly admitted to the crime. He did this without any visible signs of fear or panic. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was, in essence, detached from the gravity of the situation. What could possibly be going on in his mind? Was this a form of control for him? Was he enjoying the idea of playing a twisted game with the police, letting them know that he was in charge, that he could reveal his crime when he chose to? After all, for someone like Jamie, confession might have been just another way of showing how far he could push his boundaries, how much he could manipulate the situation, and how little he truly cared about the consequences. Or was it something even more chilling? Was Jamie confessing because he believed that by doing so, he would somehow be able to continue his cycle of control? In his mind, perhaps confessing to the police wasn't a sign of remorse, it was simply the next step in the power play. He had already controlled Georgia. He had already taken her life. Now he was controlling the narrative, controlling how he would be seen. It was as though he was staging the confession as an extension of the crime itself, a final statement of dominance. This twisted confession completely defies the normal expectations we have for criminals. In nearly every other case, a killer would attempt to hide or make up excuses. But Jamie Reynolds didn't try to evade his crime. He didn't try to act like it hadn't happened. He didn't even seem to care about the consequences of his actions. It was almost as if the confession itself was just another performance, another way for him to manipulate the situation, to show the world how untouchable he felt. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. After his confession, after he freely admitted to the crime, he didn't show remorse. He didn't express any guilt. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't cry for the life he had taken. Instead, it was as though he was completely unmoved by the destruction he had caused. It was almost as if the death of Georgia Williams hadn't meant anything to him at all. For the police officers who heard Jamie's words, it must have been a moment that was both surreal and terrifying. You could almost hear the disconnect in the room. Here was a man who had just confessed to one of the most brutal and senseless murders, and yet he was acting like he was talking about an everyday event, like it was just another piece of information. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a panic attack. It was cold. It was indifferent. It was almost as if Jamie Reynolds had become so detached from his actions that he no longer viewed them as wrong. The reality is, Jamie Reynolds' confession wasn't an act of guilt. It wasn't an emotional outpouring. It wasn't a desire to come clean. It was simply an extension of his control, a way for him to finish what he had started, to finish his twisted narrative. He confessed not because he had any empathy for Georgia Williams, not because he felt sorrow or regret, but because it was just another move in his sick game. And that in itself is terrifying because it speaks to the depths of Jamie Reynolds' coldness, to the way he viewed his crime not as something shameful or regrettable, but as just another step in his own demented play. When Jamie Reynolds was asked why he killed Georgia Williams, his response was not a string of excuses or justifications. It wasn't a tale of a broken mind or a life of hardship that led him to commit such a heinous act. It wasn't a cry for understanding or sympathy. No, when the authorities pressed him for the reason behind the murder, his answer was chilling in its simplicity: because I wanted to. Can you imagine that? A young woman, full of promise and life, a woman with dreams of serving in the Royal Air Force, suddenly snatched away, and when the question of why is asked, the answer is just a cold, flat statement of personal desire. It wasn't about hate. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about some misguided sense of justice. It wasn't even a crime of passion as some might expect from an enraged killer. It was a statement of pure, unfiltered control. The terrifying reality was that for Jamie Reynolds, the reason for George's death boiled down to one thing, one unfathomable truth. He wanted to. This is the horrifying part. It wasn't as though he had a motive rooted in any form of logic or reason that we could begin to understand. For Jamie Reynolds, the murder was simply a means to an end, and that end was having control. He had no higher reason. There was no trauma or abuse to explain his actions. There was no history of mental illness or instability that could shed light on why he did it. There was only one reason he wanted to. Think about that for a second. The gravity of that simple statement. It's as if he saw Georgia Williams not as a person, not as someone with a family, with aspirations, with a future, but as a means to satisfy a desire. She wasn't a life to him. She wasn't someone who had dreams, ambitions, or emotions. She was just an object, a vessel for him to impose his power, to control, and to take. In his mind, he wasn't committing murder because of some great emotional upheaval. He wasn't trying to get even with someone who wronged him. He wasn't even seeking vengeance. He wasn't emotionally driven at all. He simply took her life because he could, because it gave him what he wanted: control over another person, complete domination over someone who was helpless. And that's what makes this particular crime so terrifying, so unfathomable. Jamie's motivation wasn't rooted in any of the things we would expect from a murderer. There was no personal vendetta. There was no crime of passion. There was just a person who, for whatever dark and twisted reason, felt that he was entitled to take someone else's life simply because he wanted to. What does that say about the nature of his psyche? What does it mean when someone can look at another human being and say, "I did it because I wanted to"? How do we even begin to understand that? The reality is we don't. This kind of cold, calculated thinking is what separates people like Jamie Reynolds from the rest of us. It's the kind of thinking that strips another human being of their worth, of their value, and reduces them to nothing more than an object to be manipulated and destroyed at the whim of the person in control. It's a terrifying glimpse into the depths of cruelty that exist in the human mind. And yet, there was no remorse in his statement, no guilt, no sorrow for the life he had taken, the future he had destroyed. Georgia's life, her potential, her dreams, none of that mattered to Jamie. She was just something for him to possess, to dominate, to end when he chose. That cold detachment in his reasoning is what makes it so difficult to wrap our heads around. For Jamie Reynolds, murder was not a tragedy. It wasn't something that left him torn apart or consumed with regret. It was a simple choice. It was a decision. And in his mind, that decision was as valid as any other. You see, when Jamie Reynolds killed Georgia, he wasn't doing it for a cause. He wasn't trying to prove something to the world. He wasn't avenging some past wrong. There was no deep-rooted need to punish her or right a perceived injustice. The truth is, Jamie didn't need any of that. He didn't need justification. He didn't need a reason that made sense to us. All he needed was his own desire. And that's what's so terrifying about it. Because when you take someone's life for no other reason than your own personal whim, it's almost as though the person's life doesn't even matter. Georgia Williams' existence was reduced to a mere impulse in the mind of her killer. He could take her life, and he did, because in his warped reality, it was his right, because he wanted to. And there's something deeply unsettling about that, isn't there? The fact that for someone like Jamie Reynolds, the very act of killing wasn't driven by any noble cause, any revenge, or any twisted sense of justice. It was simply an exercise of power, a desire to dominate. He didn't need a reason. He just wanted to. And that's the ultimate horror here, the complete absence of empathy, the total lack of remorse. To Jamie Reynolds, George's life wasn't something sacred. It wasn't something precious. It wasn't something to be valued or respected. It was just a tool, a pawn in his quest to assert his own twisted sense of control over the world around him. Her death wasn't a tragic event to him. It was just a choice he made. So when you hear Jamie Reynolds say, "Because I wanted to," it hits you in a way you don't expect. It's not just a lack of reason. It's not just a sign of a disturbed mind. It's a terrifying statement of entitlement. The kind of entitlement that says, I can take whatever I want, whenever I want. And when that's the mindset, when a person believes they have the right to take life simply because they desire to do so, that's when the true horror begins. After Jamie Reynolds admitted to taking Georgia Williams' life, there was an overwhelming sense of disbelief and anger from the public, from her family, and from all those who had followed the case. How could someone so detached, so cold-hearted, and so utterly unrepentant take the life of a young woman who had so much ahead of her? How could someone be so utterly consumed by their own desires, willing to take another person's future away simply for the sake of control? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Jamie Reynolds faced the consequences of his actions. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The weight of Georgia's tragic death hung over every word spoken, every decision made. And then came the moment that would decide Jamie Reynolds' fate, the sentencing. It's not hard to imagine the emotions that must have surged through the room when the judge, after hearing the full extent of Jamie's brutality, announced the sentence. The severity of the crime, the senselessness of the act, the complete lack of remorse in Jamie's demeanor, all of these factors led to the inevitable conclusion. Jamie Reynolds was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Imagine hearing those words, life in prison without parole. For the victims' families, there must have been a sense of relief, a small flicker of justice amidst the sea of loss and pain. The truth, however, is that no sentence could ever truly bring Georgia back. No amount of time behind bars could ever undo the devastating loss of her life, the dreams she would never live, or the bright future that was cruelly taken from her. But still, there was something final, something concrete, about that sentence. It was a harsh reality for Jamie Reynolds, who had lived in the belief that he could do whatever he wanted with impunity, that he could take lives without facing the consequences of his actions. Now reality hit him hard. Life in prison without parole. The words are as final as they sound. No chance of release. No second chances. No possibility of redemption. The judge made it clear Jamie Reynolds had taken a life, and for that he would never walk free again. It was as if the court was trying to send a clear message to not only Jamie, but to anyone who might think they could ever get away with such an atrocity. There is no escaping justice. But what does a life sentence really mean? For Jamie, it meant being locked away behind bars for the rest of his life. It meant a future filled with isolation, loss, and the harsh reality of facing the consequences of his actions. It meant being removed from the world that he once controlled, a world in which he could take what he wanted, when he wanted, without any fear of reprisal. Now he would live in a confined space, cut off from the freedoms he once had, with no hope of ever re-entering society again. Yet, it's important to recognize that the sentence didn't only impact Jamie. It had a profound effect on Georgia's family and loved ones. A life sentence for Jamie Reynolds was a bitter form of justice for the loss of a beautiful, kind-hearted young woman who would never get to live out her dreams. Her family would never get to see her achieve her goals, find happiness, and experience all the things that life had in store for her. They would never be able to wrap their arms around her again, never hear her voice, never share another moment with her. The sentence, while definitive, was not enough to heal the heartache, the grief, and the longing that would stay with them forever. But still, the finality of Jamie's sentence was a small victory in the pursuit of justice. It meant that he would no longer be able to harm anyone else. that he would be kept away from society where he could never again act on his twisted desires. The sentence meant that the people in his community, the women he had once targeted, would no longer be in danger from him. For all the pain and suffering he caused, the sentence served as a reminder that justice had been served in this particular case. Still, Jamie Reynolds' life sentence felt hollow to many. For those who had followed the case closely, it was impossible not to ask, how does one truly make up for the senseless loss of a life? How can a legal sentence restore what was stolen in such a brutal and thoughtless act? No amount of prison time would ever bring Georgia back. No matter how long Jamie was locked away, there would always be an empty space where her laughter, her kindness, and her future should have been. And then there's the larger question that looms. What was the price of Georgia's life? Was it truly equal to the sentence that Jamie received? Could anything ever truly be fair in the face of such cruelty? The truth is, no amount of time behind bars could ever fully make up for the loss of a life that had so much potential. The sentence, though just, was not a replacement for the life that was taken. However, for those who believed in the need for justice, there was some measure of closure in the fact that Jamie Reynolds would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to harm anyone again. It was a small comfort, one that didn't ease the pain but at least put a final stamp on the chapter of Georgia Williams' death. Her family would not have to endure the idea that Jamie might walk free one day, that he might get another chance to destroy a life in the same way he destroyed hers. His future was now confined to the walls of a prison cell, and for that, there was a small sense of justice, even if it could never truly fill the void left by her loss. In the end, Jamie Reynolds' sentence was more than just a punishment. It was a final acknowledgement that there were consequences for taking a life, no matter how callous the act. It was a grim reminder that for every person like Georgia Williams, whose life was stolen so violently, there should be a price to pay. And for Jamie Reynolds, the price was life behind bars, never to walk free again. Georgia Williams' story, in its painful and heart-wrenching entirety, became a tragic warning that echoed far beyond the walls of her community. It wasn't just the loss of a young woman with an immense future ahead of her. It was the stark reminder that danger can hide in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it lurks within the very people you think you know, the ones who seem harmless, the ones who have found a way to weave themselves into the fabric of your life, without you even realizing the threat they pose. It's easy to think of danger as something that comes from the outside, something obvious, something that stands out like a flashing red light. We imagine that predators are people we can spot from a mile away, or situations that clearly spell trouble. We like to think that if we're careful, if we take the right precautions, we can avoid harm. But Georgia's story turned that illusion on its head. The danger didn't come from a faceless stranger lurking in the shadows. It came from someone who had found a blend-in to become part of the world she trusted. Someone who could manipulate and hide his true nature behind the guise of normalcy. Jamie Reynolds wasn't some foreign threat or an outsider. He wasn't a monster who stepped out of the dark with no connection to Georgia. No, he was someone who had slowly and quietly become part of her life. He was someone who had presented himself as a harmless person, someone who convinced Georgia, and perhaps others around him, that he was just another ordinary person. This is the chilling reality of Georgia's case. She had no reason to suspect that the man she met, a man she had no real reason to fear, would one day take her life. This is what makes her story so profoundly unsettling. The killer was someone she trusted, someone who took advantage of her innocence and her good nature. Georgia's tragic fate reveals a horrifying truth. There are people who hide their darkest impulses behind masks of normality, and their true nature only reveals itself when it's far too late. Jamie Reynolds didn't look like a dangerous man, and because of that, he slipped under the radar. He was able to manipulate Georgia into thinking she was just part of an ordinary photo shoot, an innocent activity that seemed harmless enough. The horror that followed came from the fact that Georgia had no idea what kind of danger she was walking into when she arrived at his home. Her death was not just a loss of a young life. It was a devastating reminder of how we, as a society, often fail to recognize the warning signs in people we think we know. There are countless cases where the predator is able to hide in plain sight, camouflaged in the very people who appear the most harmless. Whether through charm, manipulation, or sheer deceit, these predators manage to lull their victims into a false sense of safety. And Georgia, tragically, became one of those victims. Her murder served as an illustration of the ugly truth. Trust can be a weapon in the hands of someone who knows how to wield it. In the aftermath, Georgia's family and friends were left to grapple with this profound and painful lesson. They were left to question how someone they hadn't known to be a threat could turn into such a monster. They were left searching for answers that would never come. No one could have predicted how Jamie Reynolds would betray the trust of the people around him, or how Georgia would find herself in the hands of a man who harbored such deep, horrifying desires. But beyond the grief and confusion that surrounded Georgia's death, her story also became a pivotal moment of awareness. It served as a stark reminder that we must always be vigilant, not just for ourselves but for the people we care about. We must never be so blinded by familiarity that we overlook the potential dangers around us. Jamie Reynolds wasn't some stranger that Georgia stumbled upon in a dark alley. He was someone who had created a facade of normalcy, someone who knew exactly how to lower her defenses and trick her into trusting him. And once he had gained that trust, he was able to carry out his horrific act. In the wake of Georgia's death, people began to question the assumptions they made about the people they interacted with. How often do we make judgments about someone's character based on superficial interactions? How many times do we believe that if someone seems ordinary, or if they fit into the mold of what we expect, they're not capable of harm? Georgia's story forced us to confront the fact that even those who appear harmless can hide a much darker side. This tragic event was not just about one young woman's untimely death. It became a cautionary tale about how deeply we need to be aware of the hidden dangers that might lie within the very people we trust. It forced us to acknowledge that sometimes the people who pose the greatest threat are the ones we least expect. We must never be complacent. No matter how safe we think we are, we must remain vigilant, question assumptions, and never take for granted that someone who appears trustworthy is, in fact, safe. And in the end, Georgia Williams' story serves as an enduring warning. It reminds us that trust is something that must be earned, not just assumed. It reminds us that even those who appear to be our friends, our acquaintances, or even our neighbors can have a darkness within them that we are unable to see. Georgia's life was tragically cut short, but in her death, she has left us with a lesson that will endure far longer than the memory of her bright smile or her unfulfilled dreams. Her story is one we must never forget. The hidden dangers in life are real, and they can come from the most unexpected places.